My daughter looked me dead in the eye the night before her wedding and said, "Dad, the best gift you could give us is if you just weren't there." She didn't whisper it. She didn't even flinch. I stood there in the kitchen of the house I'd helped pay for, holding a casserole dish her mother had left me the recipe for, and I didn't say a single word back. I just set the dish down on the counter, real slow, and walked to my room. That was a Thursday. I need to back up though, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what the 3 years before that Thursday looked like. My wife, June, passed in the spring of 2021. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There's no way to describe that kind of speed to someone who hasn't lived it. One day she's complaining her back hurts, and 8 weeks later you're choosing which hymns to play at the funeral. I didn't have time to prepare. I don't think you ever do. But I really didn't. My daughter Melissa was 26 when her mother died. She'd been living in an apartment in Columbus with her boyfriend, a guy named Preston, who I'd met maybe 4 times before June passed. He worked in logistics, wore a lot of fleece vests, never quite looked me in the eye when we shook hands, which I noticed but didn't say anything about. June always said I read too much into handshakes. After the funeral, Melissa started calling more. Almost every night for the first few months. I thought it was grief, the two of us leaning on each other. And it was that, partly. But it was also the beginning of something else, though I didn't see it clearly at the time. The first ask came about 4 months after June's funeral. Melissa called on a Sunday afternoon and said Preston had found a house. A good one, she said. Older neighborhood, good school district, needed a little work, but had good bones. They wanted to put in an offer but were short on the down payment. She asked if I could help. I had the money. June and I had been careful our whole lives. I worked 31 years in municipal water management for the county, and June had been a school librarian for 24 years. We weren't wealthy, but we were steady. We had savings. We had the equity from our house in Findlay, which I'd sold after June died because the place was too big and too quiet. I wired Melissa $43,000. I want to be honest about this part. I didn't do it because she pressured me. I did it because she was my daughter and she'd just lost her mother, and I wanted to do something that felt like building instead of grieving. Buying a house felt like the future. I told myself it was an investment in her happiness. Preston said thank you exactly once in a text message. Thanks, Mr. Calhoun. Really appreciate it. That was it. 6 months later, Melissa called again. The house needed a new roof. The inspection had flagged it, but they'd bought anyway, assuming they could handle it. They couldn't. The quote came in at $11,000. I sent $11,000. Then there was the HVAC system the following winter, $8,200. Then Preston's truck needed to be replaced, and they were upside down on the loan. I co-signed for a new one. By the time Preston proposed to Melissa, I had put in just over $67,000 across various needs and emergencies, and what I can only describe as a slow, comfortable assumption that I would always say yes. I was happy when they got engaged. I genuinely was. I called Melissa the morning after she told me, and I cried a little. The good kind, because June would have been over the moon. June would have been on the phone with every woman she knew before noon. But June wasn't here. So I was the one who sat at my kitchen table in my apartment in Findlay and felt the happiness and the missing her at the same time. The way you do when something good happens and the first person you want to tell is gone. The wedding planning started, and that's when things shifted. Preston's mother, a woman named Vivienne, arrived like weather. I say that because you can't stop weather. You can prepare for it. You can board up the windows, but it's coming regardless. Vivienne had opinions about every detail of the wedding, which might have been fine except her opinions always seemed to organize themselves against mine. I wanted to contribute to the wedding costs. I'd offered $20,000 toward the reception, which I thought was reasonable given I was the bride's father and it was the only wedding my daughter was ever going to have. Vivienne felt that since Preston's family was larger, they should have more say in the venue. The venue Vivienne preferred cost $38,000 for the space alone. I told Melissa I couldn't bridge that gap on top of everything else. She told me Vivienne had already put a deposit down. I paid my $20,000. Vivienne's family paid the rest and made sure everyone knew it. I started to notice things after that. Small things. The kind you talk yourself out of because you love someone and you want to believe the best. I'd call Melissa on a Tuesday and she'd call back Thursday. I'd mention coming down for a weekend and she'd say they were busy. They'd let me know. I drove the 2 hours to Columbus for Preston's birthday dinner in November. Melissa had asked me to come, and when I arrived, Vivienne was already there, already seated at the head of the table. And my place setting was at the far end next to Preston's college roommate who talked about fantasy football for 45 minutes. I'm not a man who needs to be the center of anything. I raised my daughter to be independent. I'm proud that she is. But there's a difference between independence and erasure, and somewhere in those months before the wedding, I started to feel erased. I didn't say this to Melissa. I should have. That's something I've turned over many times since. Whether any of this would have gone differently if I'd sat her down and said plainly, I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't understand why. But I didn't. I kept thinking it would even out. I kept telling myself I was being sensitive. In January, about 6 months before the June wedding date, Melissa called and asked if I'd be willing to move to Columbus for the year leading up to the wedding. Not into their house, they didn't have room, but nearby. She said it would be easier for planning, and she wanted me close. I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 days and then I said yes. I found a 1-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from their house. I signed a 14-month lease. I paid first, last, and security. I bought furniture because most of mine was in storage after selling the Finlay house. I was 61 years old and I was starting over in a city I didn't know, in an apartment with beige walls because my daughter asked me to be close. I want to be fair here. The first 2 months were good. Melissa and I had coffee on Saturday mornings. I came over for Sunday dinners a few times. I fixed a leaking faucet in their guest bathroom and Preston said, "Good deal, thanks," and clapped me on the shoulder. Then Vivienne started coming into town more. Once a month, then twice. Then it seemed like she was just always there. And when Vivienne was there, my calls went to voicemail. My Saturday coffee invitations got rescheduled. When I did see Melissa, Preston was always present, and Vivienne's influence was always somehow in the room even when she wasn't. I started spending my Saturdays alone. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I need you to understand the geography of where I was, emotionally, when that Thursday night happened. I had rearranged my life. I had spent money I'd saved from my own retirement. I was living in a beige apartment 12 minutes from my daughter's house, and I was spending my weekends watching baseball by myself. 2 weeks before the wedding, Melissa called and asked if I'd be willing to sit at a different table during the reception. Not the family table. She said the seating had gotten complicated. Vivienne's extended family was large and they needed to reorganize. She said they'd put me with some of Preston's cousins who were really fun. I said I'd think about it. I didn't say what I was actually thinking, which was that I was the bride's father, and I'd contributed $67,000 to her adult life, and $20,000 to this specific wedding, and the idea of sitting at a cousin's table was not something I was going to accept quietly. But I didn't say that. I said I'd think about it. Then came the Thursday. I'd driven over with the casserole because Melissa had mentioned she was stressed and hadn't had time to cook. It was June's recipe. Chicken and rice with the cream of mushroom. The one Melissa used to request for her birthday every year growing up. I thought it might be a comfort. Preston answered the door. He looked surprised to see me, then looked over his shoulder, then stepped aside to let me in. Melissa was in the kitchen already. She looked tired. She looked like she'd been crying, or maybe like she was about to. I set the casserole on the counter and I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. I said she didn't seem fine. Then she said it. She said, "Dad, I need to be honest with you. Preston and I have talked about this, and we really feel like the wedding would go more smoothly if you weren't there." I know that sounds harsh, but Vivienne's family is a lot, and you sometimes make things tense, and we just think the best gift you could give us is if you weren't at the wedding. I looked at Preston. He was looking at the floor. I looked back at my daughter. She was looking at me in that way. People look at you when they've rehearsed what they're going to say, and now they just have to get through it. I didn't yell. I'm not a man who yells. I said, "All right, Melissa." That was all I said. I walked to the counter. I picked up the casserole dish, still warm through the cloth I'd wrapped it in, and I walked out the door. I sat in my car in their driveway for a few minutes. Not because I was falling apart, though something in my chest was doing something I didn't have a word for. I sat there because I was making a decision, and I wanted to make it clearly, without emotion, running the numbers. Then I drove back to my apartment, set the casserole on my own kitchen table, and I called my attorney. His name is Bob Tanner. He's been my attorney for 20 years, handled everything from June's estate to the sale of the Findlay house. I called him at 7:40 on a Thursday night, and he picked up because that's the kind of attorney Bob is. I told him what had happened, and then I reminded him of something we had put in place 18 months earlier, when I'd first started transferring money to Melissa and Preston. When I made that initial $43,000 transfer Bob had suggested. And I want to be clear that it was his suggestion, not mine. Because I hadn't been thinking like that at the time, he'd suggested we document the transfer not as a gift, but as a structured loan with deferred repayment terms, meaning there was a promissory note, meaning there was a recorded lien on the property, subordinate to the mortgage, but real. Meaning that $43,000 was not legally a gift, it was a loan. The additional amounts, the roof, the HVAC, 2 others I haven't mentioned, had been added to the note as amendments over time. Again at Bob's suggestion, again signed by both Melissa and Preston at the time of each transfer. Total documented amount, $61,400. The rest, the wedding contribution, the truck cosign, were structured differently, and I had less leverage there. But $61,400 was documented. I had never mentioned the note to Melissa. Not because I was hiding it. Because I genuinely hadn't planned to use it. I'd filed it away the way you file away insurance paperwork, hoping you'll never need it. I needed it now. Bob walked me through the options. I wasn't going to demand immediate repayment. That's not who I am, and the money wasn't the point. But I asked him to draft a formal notice acknowledging the debt and requesting a repayment conversation to be delivered by certified mail Monday morning. That way, it was on record. That way, they knew I knew. Then I did something that cost me less money but probably meant more. I called the wedding venue the next morning, Friday, and I withdrew my $20,000 contribution. I had confirmed with the venue coordinator 3 months earlier that my portion was held separately as a named deposit, a detail Vivian's camp had apparently not paid attention to. When you put $20,000 somewhere, you have the right to ask how it's held. The coordinator confirmed I could withdraw it. It would create a shortfall on the venue balance. I withdrew it. I also called the florist, where I had placed a $1,500 deposit on the centerpiece arrangement as a surprise for Melissa. I withdrew that too. Then I went back to my apartment, reheated the casserole, and I ate dinner alone. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. I didn't exactly. I felt like a man who had done what needed doing and was going to have to live with the shape of it. I felt like I'd kept a promise to myself that I hadn't even known I'd made until that Thursday night in the kitchen. The wedding was Saturday. I wasn't there. I drove to Findlay instead. I have an old friend there, a man named Curtis, who I've known since we were both 23 years old and working the same crew for the county. Curtis knew June. He came to her funeral and stayed after everyone left and sat with me on the porch until it got dark. I called him Friday night and asked if I could come up for the weekend, and he said, "Get in the car." I spent Saturday with Curtis and his wife Barbara. We had breakfast at the diner on Main Street that's been there since 1987. We watched a ball game. Barbara made ribs for dinner. It was a completely ordinary Saturday, which was exactly what I needed. My phone rang 6 times that day. I didn't answer. Sunday, I drove back to Columbus. Monday, Melissa called. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was 8 minutes long. It started angry, then went somewhere that sounded like hurt, and then near the end she was crying. She said the venue had nearly canceled because of the shortfall. She said Vivian's family had covered it, but the whole morning had been chaotic. She said she didn't understand why I would do something like that. I listened to it twice. Then I called Bob and told him to send the notice. It was another week before Melissa called again. This time, I picked up. She asked me why. Not accusatory, just why. The word had a different weight than it did in the voicemail. I told her the truth, not all at once and not perfectly. But I told her about the Saturday mornings that got canceled. I told her about the cousins' table. I told her about standing in their driveway after she said what she said, and the decision I made sitting in the car. I told her I loved her and that loving her didn't mean accepting that. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know it had gotten that bad." And I believed her. I don't think Melissa is a bad person. I don't think she sat down and planned to push her father to the margins. I think she was 29 years old and in love and managing Vivienne and planning a wedding, and she made choices without fully seeing what they cost. That's not an excuse, but it's a thing I can hold on to when I'm trying not to be bitter. Preston was harder. He called me 3 days after Melissa did. His voice had that flat, controlled quality of someone who has decided to be calm. He said he understood I was upset, but felt my actions had been disproportionate, and that withdrawing financial support at the last minute was not something a reasonable person does. I let him finish. Then I said, "Preston, I've been reasonable for 3 years. I was reasonable when you didn't call to thank me for the down payment. I was reasonable when the roof and the HVAC happened. I was reasonable when I moved to Columbus at 61 years old and furnished an apartment I didn't want because your wife asked me to be close. I was reasonable right up until the night your wife asked me not to come to her wedding. That's when I stopped." He didn't have much to say after that. What happened next took several months and it wasn't clean. Melissa and I had a real conversation, the kind we should have had long before any of this, where she talked about feeling caught between me and Vivienne, about not knowing how to manage 2 families with such different styles, about making choices out of exhaustion that she hadn't thought through. I talked about June. I talked about how much of my grief I'd poured into being useful to her and Preston, and how being told to disappear had broken something I hadn't known was already fragile. We cried, both of us, on the phone, which felt strange and also necessary. On the loan, Bob sent the formal notice which clarified the terms. Melissa and Preston acknowledged it. We agreed on a repayment structure that started the following January, modest monthly amounts over 8 years, which I honestly don't need but which existed on paper, and that was the point. The point was that it was real. It was documented. It wasn't a gift that could be received and then forgotten. Vivienne never called. I didn't expect her to, and I didn't want her to. My relationship with Melissa now is different. I want to be honest about that too. It's not like it was before any of this, and it's not like it was when June was alive and Melissa was 22 and the 3 of us would have Sunday dinners and nobody was keeping score of anything. It's more careful now, more deliberate. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe careful is what we needed to be all along and we just weren't. I still live in Columbus. I thought about going back to Findlay, but I didn't want to run away from something that I'd started to rebuild. Melissa and I have coffee on Saturday mornings sometimes. Not every week, but sometimes. And when we do, she doesn't look past me the way she used to. She looks at me. That's enough for now. I'm not angry anymore. Anger takes energy and I'd rather spend mine on other things. On Curtis, on the Saturday morning walks I've started taking along the Scioto, on the woodworking class I joined at the community center in March, because I'd always meant to learn and I finally decided to stop meaning and start doing. June would have hated all of it. The conflict, the loan notice, withdrawing the money. She was a woman who believed in talking things through over casserole before they got to legal notices. She was probably right. She was right about most things, but she also would have understood why I sat in that car on Thursday night and made the decision I made. Because June knew me better than anyone, and she knew that there is a version of kindness that isn't kindness at all. It's just fear wearing a softer coat. I wasn't afraid anymore. That was the beginning of the rest of it. Sometimes the right moment finds you when you've run out of reasons to wait. The money, the years, the careful patience that had slowly turned into something more like disappearing on my own terms before anyone could ask me to again. It all clarified in one night. In a kitchen, holding a casserole dish that was still warm. I drove to Findlay on a Saturday. I came back on a Sunday. And for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I stood. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually went wrong. Not the night in the kitchen. That was just the moment everything became visible. What went wrong started years earlier, in the quiet space between what I gave and what I said about it. Every time Melissa called with a need, I wired money without a conversation. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because I told myself that's what good fathers do. They show up, they fill the gaps, they don't make their children feel like a burden by attaching conditions to love. I believe that. I still believe a version of it. But somewhere in believing it, I confused being generous with being silent. And silence over enough time doesn't read as grace. It reads as availability without limit. That's the thing I had to sit with. Vivienne didn't create the problem. Preston didn't create the problem. Even Melissa, standing in that kitchen saying what she said, she wasn't the origin of it. I had spent 3 years making myself easy to take for granted, not because I'm weak, because I was grieving and being needed felt like the closest thing I had left to being necessary. When June died, I poured everything I had into being useful to my daughter, and I never once asked if what I was building was a relationship or just a transaction dressed up in love. The promissory note saved me financially, but what saved me as a person was that Thursday night in the driveway, sitting alone in the car, deciding that I was not going to absorb this one quietly. That was the first honest thing I'd done in 3 years, not the lawyer call that came after. The honest thing was making the decision that I was worth something more than what I'd been accepting. There's a line I keep coming back to. My father used to say, "How you let people treat you is the standard you set, not the one they choose." I used to think that was hard advice, the kind older men give when they've run out of patience for complexity. But I understand it differently now. It's not about being hard. It's about being clear. Melissa wasn't clear with me, but I also wasn't clear with I kept the loan documents in a folder and told myself I'd never need them, which was another way of pretending that everything was fine when I already knew it wasn't. What I learned is that generosity without honesty isn't generosity. It's avoidance. And avoidance has a cost that always comes due, either in one Thursday night kitchen conversation or spread across 100 smaller moments that quietly hollow you out. I don't tell this story because Melissa is a villain. She isn't. I tell it because I spent 3 years becoming invisible in my own family and I thought patience was the answer. It wasn't. Patience without boundaries is just a longer way to disappear. And I'd been disappearing long before she ever asked me to. The Saturday I drove to Finley, that was the day I stopped.